Did Jesus, in the fourth gospel, ever express compassion? Not really. Then how come so many Christians regard compassion as the primary virtue? Bruce Charlton. If the fourth gospel is regarded as the primary and most authoritative source concerning Jesus Christ, then it seems that Jesus hardly ever, maybe never, expressed compassion as we moderns would understand it. Jesus did a lot of alleviating suffering, including in the miracles and illustrated in parables, but the purpose seems always to have been teaching, not compassion. Jesus did very little in the way of expressing sympathy for individuals. On the contrary, his typical tone is one of scathing criticism, even a kind of sarcasm. Jesus was very seldom nice, mostly nasty. Of course Jesus did express and act upon love a great deal, more than anything, but my point is that compassion is not love, but an optional subset of loving behaviors, and one that Jesus neither asked for nor modeled for us. Going through the fourth gospel up to the events of the Passion, it can be seen that compassion was not the focus of the major episodes. The miracle at the wedding of Cana, Jesus is pretty sharp and scathing in his words. The Nicodemus episode, again Jesus is almost mocking towards Nicodemus, in his efforts to snap Nicodemus out of his habitual thinking. The Samaritan woman at the well, Jesus adopts a stern tone towards the woman. The nobleman who asks Jesus to heal his dying son, Jesus is very matter of fact, no compassion expressed. The healing by the pool at Bethesda, again no compassion, mostly focused on teaching about the Sabbath. Feeding the 5,000, Jesus goes to great lengths to present this as not about feeding the hungry, but instead an illustration of the transience of earthly bread compared with heavenly bread. The woman taken in adultery, Jesus is very crisp towards her, despite that she is facing a horrible death, and instead mostly addresses the accusing bystanders on the subject of sin. Healing the man born blind, again, no compassion expressed, instead Jesus says the whole thing, including, it seems, the man's lifelong blindness, was so that the works of God should be made manifest in him, teaching, not sympathy. And so on. Jesus' message is about what we want most. Is it resurrected eternal life in heaven, or something else? Those who most want compassion, and regard compassion for suffering as the highest ethical value, should look elsewhere, Buddhism perhaps. But not to Jesus Christ. Or maybe they should consider where a primary ethic of compassion will ultimately lead them. Did Jesus really say sin no more in the fourth gospel? Bruce Charlton. There are two places in the fourth gospel, in the authorized version, where Jesus is quoted as saying sin no more. After healing the man by the pool at Bethesda.
The Jews therefore said unto him that was cured, It is the Sabbath day, it is not lawful for thee to carry thy bed. He answered them, He that made me whole, the same said unto me, Take up thy bed, and walk. Then asked they him, What man is that which said unto thee, Take up thy bed, and walk? And he that was healed wist not who it was, for Jesus had conveyed himself away, a multitude being in that place. Afterward Jesus findeth him in the temple, and said unto him, Behold, thou art made whole, sin no more, lest a worse thing come unto thee. The man departed, and told the Jews that it was Jesus, which had made him whole.
Following the episode of the woman taken in adultery.
And they which heard it, being convicted by their own conscience, went out one by one, beginning at the eldest, even unto the last, and Jesus was left alone, and the woman standing in the midst. When Jesus had lifted up himself, and saw none but the woman, he said unto her, Woman, where are those thine accusers? Hath no man condemned thee? She said, No man, Lord. And Jesus said unto her, Neither do I condemn thee, go, and sin no more. Then spake Jesus again unto them, saying, I am the light of the world, he that followeth me shall not walk in darkness, but shall have the light of life.
The problem is that, as a straightforward order given to any human being, sin no more is impossible, hence nonsense, because the very essence of Jesus' teaching is that all men are sinners and no men can cease from sinning. Which is a major reason why the incarnation and work of Jesus is necessary. So the alternative is to finesse the statements into something specific, that might be true. But there is no context that the man beside the pool in chapter 5 has sinned as a cause of his infirmity, so that sin no more seems irrelevant, as well as impossible. Furthermore, when Jesus is quoted as uttering the following lest a worse thing come unto thee, well, to my eye this threat identifies the sentence as a later and false interpolation. And, indeed, the entirety of verse 14 can be deleted without loss of continuity. What of the usage in chapter 8? Well, here again the phrase go, and sin no more can comfortably be deleted, and this deletion also avoids the contradiction between neither do I condemn thee and sin no more. On this internal evidence, I regard the phrase sin no more as alien to the fourth gospel, alien to Jesus' teaching, and thus presumably a later addition by some other hand. Belief in the supernatural/paranormal/occult phenomena. Bruce Charlton. I don't know how unusual it is, but I find that I combine a firm belief in the reality of many supernatural/paranormal/occult phenomena, with an almost 100% reflex disbelief in the objective reality of nearly all specific examples of these phenomena, by nearly everybody. So, although in principle I am convinced of the reality of, in no particular order, telepathy, ghosts, miracles, synchronicity, personal destiny, magic, purposive personal evil, demons, angels, fairies. Nonetheless, I am very skeptical of the objective truth of almost every single report of such things I have encountered. Even among people whom I respect and trust, I find I often do not believe the specific truth of what they say or write. And indeed, to my mind, across such people, they have said and written a vast range of incompatible, and often incoherent things. If I tried to base my life upon believing the specific information, facts and understandings, of even those relatively few sincere persons who I respect and trust, I would nonetheless be building my faith on a seething mass of sand, rubble, and water, not on solid rock. Something seems to happen in the process of communicating such phenomena, in the transfer of knowledge between the personal realm and public discourse. Such phenomena become, to me, unconvincing, not something I feel that has the kind of validity upon which I could depend. Thus, in almost every instance of reading or hearing about such things, I feel a rising sense of mistrust and rejection. This is confirmed by the apparent fact that such communications seem to take place in the context of subcultures of cultivated credulity, I mean groups of people who, it seems to me, have a kind of pact of mutual belief. I have studied several of these in some depth, and this is how such groups seem to work, I mean on the basis of a tacit agreement to believe, almost, any and all such claims. This is why I try to refrain from ever communicating my own such experiences, because I know that they will be unconvincing to others, that there are many alternative mundane explanations, they can be explained away or else my own honesty and competence will be rejected, and therefore in making such communications I feel an almost irresistible temptation to persuade, exaggerate, distort, and I assume others do also. This is an interesting and significant metaphysical situation, I mean, one in which a whole world of vitally important phenomena cannot, apparently, accurately and honestly be discussed in objective public discourse. Yet that does seem to be the actual situation. We can publicly discuss and analyze these matters in general and in principle, but, seemingly, not specifically. Note added, as I've said a few times before, I think the reason for this mismatch between personal and public knowledge is an important aspect of our times and place, and the nature of human consciousness as it has become. It is one aspect of the change from a pooled and mutually aware group consciousness, to the greater freedom and agency, but also alienation, cut-offness, isolation, of spontaneous human awareness and thinking. The point is not to resist or attempt to reverse this change, but to accept and take responsibility for the fact and necessity of our free agency. Explicitly to take personal responsibility for choosing our own fundamental assumptions about the true nature of reality, rather than, as in earlier eras, aspiring passively to obey authoritative external sources of validation. Be ye perfect. William Wildblood. We live in a messy, imperfect and out of balance world, and we are messy, imperfect and out of balance people. However, we are shooting for the stars. Jesus said, "Be ye perfect as your Father in heaven is perfect," but he was the most forgiving and compassionate of souls. He was demanding and exacting, and yet he understood human weakness and frailty like no other. We have to have the highest possible standards because that is the truth, the only truth, that will set us free. At the same time, we must accept that we and others will fall short. If we aim for anything less than perfect, we will never escape this world, but because we are in this world we can never be perfect. We will always fail. Until by the grace of God we succeed. Any spiritual path that is valid is extreme in its demands. A teaching that reflects divine reality must be absolutist and perfectionist because those are the qualities of divine reality. In this relative world of imperfection, these standards can never be met, but we should always strive to attain them and not excuse or justify failure. A real teacher demands the best from his pupils but knows they will fall short. That doesn't matter as long as they keep the vision before them. Here is the problem. We must free our soul of sin, but we can never actually do that. What we can do is set our hand to the plow and keep trying. That shows our heart is rightly oriented, which is the important thing. If we wholeheartedly dedicate ourselves to God, then He will wash the soul clean. We cannot do that ourselves, but we can offer ourselves to Him and open our heart and mind to His purifying love. That means love on our part. It is love that overcomes sin, the love that has the willingness to sacrifice self at its root. Nothing else will do. Not knowledge, not wisdom, not higher consciousness, whatever that is. And if you love me, you keep my commandments. Why I talk about the paranormal? William James Tychonievich. Bruce Charlton has an important new post up, belief in the supernatural/paranormal/occult phenomena. He begins thus. Quote, "I don't know how unusual it is, but I find that I combine a firm belief in the reality of many supernatural/paranormal/occult phenomena, with an almost 100% reflex disbelief in the objective reality of nearly all specific examples of these phenomena, by nearly everybody. So, although in principle I am convinced of the reality of, in no particular order, telepathy, ghosts, miracles, synchronicity, personal destiny, magic, purposive personal evil, demons, angels, fairies. Nonetheless, I am very skeptical of the objective truth of almost every single report of such things I have encountered. Even among people whom I respect and trust, I find I often do not believe the specific truth of what they say or write." End quote. I don't know how unusual it is, not unusual at all, I would wager. I assume that most people can easily understand and sympathize with Bruce's stance here, and that most of us probably share it at least, to some degree and with respect to some phenomena. It's obviously somewhat paradoxical, though. On what grounds does one assent to a general truth, or what does it even mean to say that one so assents, if one rejects every one of the specifics on which the generalization is based? If there is no X such that I believe X to be a genuine instance of telepathy, for example, why would I say I have a firm belief in the reality of telepathy? Bruce emphasizes his skepticism of reports of the paranormal, so one possibility is that his firm belief in various phenomena is based entirely on his own first-hand experience. I think this is unlikely to be the whole story, though, since there are so many different phenomena in which he believes. It seems highly improbable that he personally has seen ghosts and angels and fairies and miracles and so on through the whole list. We could also note the qualifiers he uses, almost 100%, nearly all, nearly everybody, and infer that for each category of phenomena on his list there exists at least one specific instance in which he firmly believes, and that, since one well-authenticated ghost is all it takes to establish that ghosts exist, it is on these exceptional cases that his general beliefs rest. I doubt this is the case, though. If asked, for example, which ghost stories do you find uniquely convincing? I assume he wouldn't have any to point to. Another possibility is that the firm general beliefs are logical inferences. For example, each and every one of my beliefs is, by definition, something that I believe to be true. Nevertheless, at the meta level, I recognize my own fallibility and am therefore firmly convinced that some of my beliefs, a great many of them, in all likelihood, are in fact false. A general belief in miracles can be similarly grounded. Given the fallibility of our knowledge, it is virtually certain that some phenomena we consider to be impossible are in fact possible and do occur, and these are what we call miracles. For more specific paranormal beliefs, though, this doesn't seem to work. From what general principles could one derive the likely existence of ghosts, say, or of fairies? I don't see how such beliefs can be anything other than empirical. It's possible, then, that stances like Bruce's are inherently unstable, and that this can only be resolved by persisting in one's folly one way or the other. During my atheist years, I found myself in the opposite but equally unstable position of officially not believing in anything supernatural while at the same time believing in practice in certain specific instances. I would often find myself saying things like, "Of course I don't believe in omens, but this is pretty clearly an omen." In the end I came to understand this as a sign that I was not being honest with myself about my own beliefs. My attempts to rectify those discrepancies, particularly with regard to free will, in which I purportedly disbelieved, precipitated my eventual reconversion to theism, and a supernatural worldview. Coming back to Bruce's post, he writes of those who claim paranormal experiences. Quote, "And indeed, to my mind, across such people, they have said and written a vast range of incompatible, and often incoherent things. If I tried to base my life upon believing the specific information, facts and understandings, of even those relatively few sincere persons who I respect and trust, I would nonetheless be building my faith on a seething mass of sand, rubble, and water, not on solid rock." End quote. I agree with this. We cannot base our beliefs or lives on anything as slippery as the paranormal. That is, we can't believe something simply because it was allegedly communicated by an angel or a miracle or a synchronicity or whatever. We have to judge content from such sources the same way we judge any other content. I discussed this in my post Who or What is the Ultimate Spiritual Authority? A Mormon Perspective. As is well documented on this blog, I learned this lesson the hard way after making some extremely confident predictions about the outcome of the 2020 election based on synchronicity alone, some really extraordinary synchronicities, I must say, most of which were objective and publicly verifiable, meaning the fact that there were such synchronicities, not the correct interpretation of the same, but the predictions failed. I've been quoting John Dominic Crossan on this for decades now.
Altered states of consciousness, such as dreams and visions, are something common to our humanity, something hardwired into our brains, something as normal as language itself. They were recognized as common possibilities in the early 1st century, and they are still recognized as such in the late 20th century. And only when their human normalcy is accepted can a proper response be offered. That response should not be, "We deny the fact of your vision." It should be, "Tell us the content of your vision." And then we will have to judge, not whether you had it or not, but whether we should follow it or not.
The distinction Crossan makes is an important one which perhaps tends to be blurred by Bruce's ambiguous language about believing in the reality of the phenomena. Questioning whether someone in fact had the experience they claim to have had is entirely different from questioning the conclusions they draw from it. I generally suspend judgment on the correct interpretation of paranormal experiences, including my own, to a degree that sometimes annoys others. When otherwise trustworthy people report the fact of a paranormal experience, though, I mostly believe them, mostly because of the danger Bruce identifies in the following quote from his post. Quote, "This is why I try to refrain from ever communicating my own such experiences, because I know that they will be unconvincing to others, that there are many alternative mundane explanations, they can be explained away or else my own honesty and competence will be rejected, and therefore in making such communications I feel an almost irresistible temptation to persuade, exaggerate, distort, and I assume others do also." End quote. The temptation he mentions, to Photoshop one's experiences a bit in order to make them more presentable, is very real and very hard to resist. I make an effort to be strictly factual in my reports, but everyone should definitely take them all with large quantities of salt. Paranormal experiences are so slippery that articulating them at all inevitably involves distortion, and much of this will be, even with the best of conscious intentions, motivated distortion. My policy is, obviously enough, the opposite of Bruce's. I do try to communicate my paranormal experiences, and in fact for some time now this blog has consisted almost entirely of reports of synchronicities, dreams, visions, and such, with more discursive posts like the present one increasingly few and far between. In doing this, I am not trying to convince anyone of anything. I don't generally draw firm conclusions from my own experiences, let alone try to push those conclusions on others. My primary concern is simply to normalize the paranormal. To quote Crossan again, only when their human normalcy is accepted can a proper response be offered, because paranormal experiences absolutely are a normal aspect of the human condition. Quite a few people have shared theirs with me, but nearly always in confidence, on the understanding that I will keep my mouth shut, and I do. I've been there, and I sympathize, but at the same time, how much progress can we make in understanding such things when everyone is too embarrassed to compare notes? Embarrassment is fear, and fear is the mind killer. If we report our paranormal experiences, the reports will inevitably include distortion. If we systematically avoid talking about a whole area of experience, though, that's an even greater distortion. And if we coyly hint that we have had paranormal experiences without giving any specifics, the old Mormon trope of "I know by experience is too sacred to relate," well, that path has its own temptations and corrupting influences. As always, playing it safe is not really one of our options. To end on a synchronistic note, earlier today, as I was thinking about Bruce's post, a quote from William Blake came to mind, from The Ghost of Abel, and I looked it up.
To Lord Byron in the wilderness, "What doest thou here, Elijah? Can a poet doubt the visions of Jehovah? Nature has no outline, but imagination has. Nature has no tune, but imagination has. Nature has no supernatural and dissolves, imagination is eternity."
It came to mind because of the theme of doubting visions, and also probably because I've recently been reading, thinking about, and dreaming of Lord Byron. After looking it up and reading it, though, my main impression was the emphasis on the value of imagination. Before looking up the Blake quote, I had been reading section 124 of the Doctrine and Covenants, which is quite long. After rereading The Ghost of Abel, I returned to section 124 and soon encountered this passage.
"And he shall be led in paths where the poisonous serpent cannot lay hold upon his heel, and he shall mount up in the imagination of his thoughts as upon eagle's wings. Therefore, let my servant William cry aloud and spare not, with joy and rejoicing, and with hosannas to him that sitteth upon the throne forever and ever, saith the Lord your God.
Is this the only positive reference to imagination in all of Scripture? I think it may be, and it's in reference to my servant William, and is closely followed by an injunction to cry aloud and spare not, i.e., to speak up and not hold back. I took this as synchronistic confirmation that, whatever path may be right for other people, I at least should continue to speak openly about these things. To me it seemed like a message from the Cinque Fairies, though I quite understand if you, reader, reflexively doubt that. What was good and also distinctive about Western civilization/culture? Bruce Charlton. In discussing whether or not Western civilization/culture is worth defending, saving, rebuilding, there is often confusion regarding what it is, and to what extent distinctive. I tend to assume that when it comes to what might be termed the arts, literature, poetry, visual arts, architecture, dance, music, etc., there is a kind of relativity between civilizations and cultures, in the sense that each produces what it wants, and it seems overly subjective to assert the superiority of one over others. Looked at across time, and across history, it certainly seems that some bits of some civilizations, for example the music, the architecture, are better than the same bits of others, yet the cross-cultural cosmopolitanism that is able to make such comparisons is itself not really a creative or generative culture, but a second-order kind of thing, an aspect of cultural criticism rather than creativity. At any rate, I find it unconvincing to assert any distinctive superiority of Western civilization when it comes to the arts and humanities. There is superiority of my civilization for me, and for people like me, but I would not expect people of a different kind from different civilizations to see things the same way. But Western civilization since the 17th century does have a qualitative superiority over all others, past and until the recent present, which is science, more exactly, in terms of science as a social system. There have been in many times and places, and still are, individual real scientists, or even duos, or small and short-lasting groups of scientists, but it was only in Western civilization that science became a structured and multi-generational activity. It was only in Western Christendom that the necessary ethic of honesty, the truth-seeking and truth-speaking of and between scientists, became large-scale and sustained. Therefore science in the West became qualitatively more powerful and wide-ranging than at any other time or place. I think this can now be seen clearly because science is dead, or at least real science is dead. A bureaucratic professional research activity continues, now fully integrated with global totalitarianism, but this is not what used to be science, it is not real science. Science has died for lack of the reason it began, the ethic of inter-scientist honesty that created and sustained science has gone. So-called modern science is dishonest, untruthful, selectively exaggerated, deliberately misleading, from top to bottom and in external relations, therefore it is not science. It does not work. Science as a social activity has dwindled to near nothingness, and we have now reverted to the science of individual persons. Of course, science was always double-edged in its goodness. It was exceptionally honest, but only about its chosen subject. Science is based on models of reality, not reality, and like all models this means it is distorted at best and deluded at worst, yet unable, from within science, to recognize its own radical limitations and potential evils. I.e. to stay science, science absolutely needs scientists to have an external viewpoint from which to evaluate science, and keep it honest. When the West, when scientists, ceased to be Christian and Christianity was forgotten, there was no ultimate reason for scientists to be honest, not even about science, so over several decades science became, briefly, net evil, before it killed itself from corruption and fakery. My understanding is therefore that it was science that, in world historical terms, was the distinctive good of Western civilization, but that is dead and gone. While Westerners like myself love much of my civilization, after the death of real science the West no longer has anything distinctive and good to offer the world. So its demise will not be mourned by the world. Note, although Western Civ an old topic here, this particular post was triggered by Binold's recent reflections at the authorsphere. Old age starts in your 50s. Francis Berger. Assuming you manage to live that long, the focus of old age should involve spiritually turning away from the world and shifting your thinking and attention to death, salvation, and life in the next world, more precisely, heaven. All of that involves reflecting upon and contemplating spiritual learning in mortal life. I suppose that raises the question of when old age begins. Well, in my estimation, old age starts somewhere in the 50s. Yes, 50s. I'll be 53 in about 2 weeks, and I consider that to be early old age. It matters little if you make it to 100, the truth is you start getting old somewhere in your early 50s, implying that you should act and think accordingly at around that time. Old in your 50s. A half-century of contemplating death and the next world. But I can still play tennis. I just got a promotion. My sex life is spectacular, no Viagra needed. I'm still expanding my business. I'm planning a world tour after I retire. Blah, blah, blah. Fine. Dismiss it, but don't be surprised by what you get in return. The Promise of Each Morning, Days, by Ralph Waldo Emerson. Bruce Charlton.
Daughters of time, the hypocritic days. Muffled and dumb like barefoot dervishes. And marching single in an endless file. Bring diadems and faggots in their hands. To each they offer gifts after his will. Bread, kingdoms, stars, or sky that holds them all. I, in my pleached garden, watched the pomp. Forgot my morning wishes, hastily. Took a few herbs and apples, and the day turned and departed silent. I, too late. Under her solemn fillet saw the scorn. Days, by Ralph Waldo Emerson.
I don't especially like Days as poetry, nor, indeed, any poetry of Emerson's, but its message, its cry, is one that returns frequently to my mind. It is, I think, about the promise felt by people such as Emerson and myself, at the start of a day, the promise of each day, its gifts, and what we might do with them, compared with the inevitable disillusionment of the day's end, when we have not done much, or anything at all. This sentiment contrasts with the youthful optimism for the sunny future expressed in many other places by Emerson, that sense that on just such a day as this, a man such as Shakespeare, wrote something like Hamlet. And, if him, then why not me? In my own way, at my own level. The idea that nothing is stopping us, but our own narrowness of vision and triviality of ambition. In truth, it is the mismatch between optimism and actuality that leads to the disillusionment. Emerson felt great powers in himself, and indeed achieved greatly, but realized that whatever he had achieved was in the past, and he was always concerned primarily by the potential of the present moment. Shakespeare, looking back on having written Hamlet, was, no doubt, a very different, and probably sadder, creature than Shakespeare actually writing Hamlet. This is the human condition, and apparently nobody has ever eluded it, except by the suppression or obliteration of awareness that it is true. And this is exactly why the only escape from wise pessimism, from that stoic attitude which is only divided from rational suicide by irrational, yet true, residual scruples, is to know our mortal lives to be a stage or phase of experience that is both contributing towards, and destined to transform into, resurrection and the reality of a fulfilled life to come. Eternal heavenly life is not, therefore, a compensation for the deficits we now suffer. Neither is it a time of happiness nor of perfection, whatever they may be. It is instead a life in which the limitations of infirmity of will, of death, entropy, and of evil in and around us, are left behind, and we can then fulfill that morning feeling so valued, yet mourned, by Emerson. We are not supposed to look forward to life beyond life, as if it was a holiday, wanting to shorten or hasten through the intervening days before we can quit the work of this world forever, and live in perpetual leisure. But instead, we should think of heaven as a situation where we can get on with our real work, without having it continually dismantled by the fading of memory, and the hazards of this world. And having prepared ourselves as best we may by the experiences of this life, acknowledging the reality of, learning from, and seeing beyond, Emersonian disillusionment. Such disappointment with ourselves for wasted days is valid, but it is a lesson, not a conclusion. Why we are confident about things in general, while skeptical about the truth of facts, the metaphysics of the supernatural/paranormal/occult. Bruce Charlton. Following up on a post of mine from a few days ago, William James Tychonievich challenged the coherence of my statement that I believe in the reality of many supernatural/paranormal/occult phenomena, while disbelieving nearly all specific reports of such phenomena. How, he asked, could I believe in the reality of ghosts, if I did not believe in any particular report of a ghost? Surely the one depends on the other. After thinking about his argument a while, it seemed to me that William was discussing epistemology, while I was talking about metaphysics. That is, he was implicitly talking about the empirical or factual certainty of items of knowledge, while I was discussing underlying theoretical assumptions that describe the nature of reality. I have often argued here that epistemology has been an intellectual dead end, despite being the dominant philosophical mode since Descartes, exactly because it sets itself up as prior to metaphysics, indeed, typically, dismissive of metaphysics. Thus, epistemology discusses, or tries to discuss, how we can know stuff, without discussing its assumptions about the reality within which such discussion are supposed to occur. What I am implying in my discussion of supernatural etc. phenomena, is that we can, and should, be aware, clear, and explicit about our fundamental metaphysical assumptions, for example the assumption that ghosts really are true, yet in a way that does not apply to specific factual instances. This means we do not need to be sure that any specific report of a particular ghost is objectively true in order to believe that ghosts are real. We can rationally believe in ghosts in principle, but in practice reject many, most or even all of the specific reports of ghosts that come to our attention. There are some reports of paranormal phenomena from other people that I believe are true, or at least possibly true, yet that truth which I believe is, in practice, more of a working hypothesis than any kind of certainty or assumption. Nothing major hinges upon whether any particular exact report really is true. Much the same applies to aspects of public life that I can never discover. I am confident that some of the totalitarian world leaders are in alliance with Satan in some way, perhaps as willing servants or slaves, or possessed by a demon, or in other ways I don't understand, but I don't know for sure the names of even one of these leaders, and have no conceivable way of checking this in a factual sense. For me, this is a metaphysical assumption concerning the nature of reality in our world now, validated by intuition, yet with no chance of empirical validation. Metaphysics is primary. Examples of metaphysics are religions and secular ideologies. Nowadays, in the West, it is leftist secular ideology that is dominant. Because ideology structures the identity, nature and interpretation of evidence, this is why evidence can never, and almost never does, overturn ideology, and why accumulating evidence against some ideology has no effect on it. It is a commonplace insight that religions are undisprovable. Less obvious, indeed ignored, but more relevant, is that this being undisprovable by evidence applies to that mainstream modern ideology, significantly, an ideology with no name, that pervades and rules the West, is assumed in all public discourse, and is taught by every major institutions from the media to the schools and colleges. Same applies. Therefore, secular ideology is much more dangerous than any religion, as seen by the unequaled scale and nature of evil of the secular totalitarian states of the past century, since the Russian Revolution. More dangerous than religion because it will not name, and indeed denies, its own metaphysical identity, indeed, denies that it has fundamental assumptions, denies that its ruling concepts, such as class/sex/race equality, are assumptions, but instead pretends, in a circular argument, that its assumptions derive from evidence. It is an aspect of my oft iterated theme, that we need spiritually, to honestly acknowledge, become clear and explicit about our metaphysical assumptions, especially that they are indeed assumptions. Our metaphysical assumptions concerning the nature of reality are believed, and acted upon, yet such belief is of the nature of a choice and a commitment. This is not a knowledge-based belief, such as is the focus of epistemology. The qualitative distinction between committing to metaphysical assumptions and belief in particular facts is part of that argument. Dissent is not repentance, or, why gotta make a living excuse is nothing. Francis Berger. There's this line of thinking, mostly among secular alt-right, anti-woke, dissident-type bloggers, that believes that going along to get along with the system publicly is acceptable as long such plain public submission is balanced out by private objection or anonymous/pseudonymous public dissent. The rationale supporting this noble position. Hey, everyone's gotta make a living. In a post, titled, Why Anonymity Matters in Public Discourse, Small Caps Intentional, the writer who blogs under the pseudonym El Gato Malo offers the following thoughts on the subject, Gatto's text in italics, my thoughts in Roman.
There seems to be a profound undercurrent of self-styled intellectuals opposing the idea of anonymous speech. Here's why, even leaving aside such basic ideas as assess an argument on its merits as opposed to upon who made it and the shallow credentialism and ad hominem it engenders, I think anonymity remains not only important, but vital in our current world.
I was critical of anonymous/pseudonymous writers before 2020. I still hold reservations about those who express dissent publicly under false names and alter egos, but 2020 showed me that the whole business of being anonymous/pseudonymous in public discourse has become a secondary or tertiary matter within the larger scope of things. More on that later.
We live in a technocratic and bureaucratic regulatory state. Permission is required for the most mundane of activities, from catching a fish to building a house to, most of all, making a living and building a business. You need a permit or license or approval for everything. You need it to operate a restaurant, serve liquor, sell a drug, issue securities, have a bank account, practice law, practice medicine, and even if you don't, your employer almost certainly does. The list is near endless, and the greater your ambition, the more you need permission. You cannot just open a savings and loan or a lemonade stand. Such practice requires affirmative assent that can easily be withheld or revoked. When one reaches a certain point of pervasiveness in this trend, we're all essentially hostages, and when the agencies and agents that issue licensure, permission, and prerogative get politicized and weaponized, this puts many of the most astute, educated, and competent people in a real bind. They face a Hobson's choice if they would disagree with whatever narrative finds current currency. Stay silent or lose your livelihood.
No disagreement there. The above is an accurate and valid assessment of what it means to live within the totalitarian system today. We are all essentially hostages, though I would go a step further and say slaves. Now, here's the thing. How should people, Christians in particular, think, act, function, and live under the shadow of such an acknowledgement/discernment? El Gato Malo offers the following illustrative example.
Look what happened all COVID. Doctors that spoke out saw their medical licenses threatened and even taken. Laws were passed to enable and require this. Institutions lined up against anyone internally who bucked or asked questions because they themselves got the message from on high that if you want to keep being a hospital, you better shut down these ideas. Imagine a debate about a vaccine. Imagine you're the CEO or the chief science officer of a publicly traded drug company. You're well positioned to have a valid and valuable take, but if that take is one the state does not like, what will happen? Criticizing the FDA is not a path to getting your drug approved. It's likely a way to get it buried. So what do? It's easy for people to say stand up anyway. Adhere to your principles and sacrifice your livelihood and life's work. But that's always really easy to say about someone else's life, isn't it? And even that is far too limiting. So this person should allow an unrelated drug with years and tens or hundreds of millions of dollars in research behind it, a drug that could save or improve lives, get backbenched at FDA, harming them, putting his or her employees out of work, and harming shareholders and sick people because they wish to speak what they believe is the truth about another topic in which they are expert? What kind of choice is that? It's certainly not one that only affects the chooser. But this is the choice that permission-based regulatory states always create the minute they get politicized. The vast class of competent builders is silenced because to speak against the narrative means you cannot build anymore because building takes permission and permission is controlled by commissars loyal to a faction that does not brook dissent. You think loads of Fortune 500 C.E.O. think global warming isn't a scam or DEI isn't drivel? They know it's a scam. But they cannot speak lest they find their businesses under fire. Many thought the same about the mRNA jabs. Again, crickets. You simply cannot put your business and all those who work for it and depend upon it at risk from a state that practices regulatory lawfare. This creates a perfect, one-sided scenario where the business leaders who speak are nearly all pro-regime and those who oppose it are silenced in self-censorship. They do not need to be threatened directly. They know what happens if you step out of line. Nice FCC license you got there, be ashamed if you opened your fat yap and something happened to it. I see you'd like to do an S1 to IPO your company. Let's check your social credit score. Hey, remember that bank account you used to have? It's potent stuff to stifle and silence dissent from the great and good.
To summarize the above, most people probably know the system is evil and oppose it privately, but they willingly comply with the system publicly too. Make a living. Keep businesses running. Protect business and jobs. Ensure efforts to do good within the system are not threatened or snuffed out. The limits of El Gato Malo's assumptions about the fundamental nature of reality shine brighter than the noonday sun, so I won't bother wading into all of that here. What troubles me are Christians who espouse essentially identical views and attitudes about being a slave within the system. More on that later, too. Anyway, so what is El Gato Malo's ultimate solution?
And anonymity fixes this. It allows speech to flourish and creates a true market for ideas free from the market-breaking taxation without representation of speak up and lose your license that has been used to such chilling effect of late as unelected as unaccountable bureaucrats become the guardians of ideological purity and their forever state comes to dominate the speech of professions and professionals. This idea that people grab anon handles so they can lie and cheat is nearly all inversion and projection. Mostly, it's people wishing to speak freely and share such truth as they perceive without having to live beneath the constant hammer of reprisal against their lives and livelihoods. Were the Federalist Papers published under Publius a problem, or a solution? Were they a cowardly subterfuge and refusal to own up to opinion or a brave attempt to move the Overton window and build consensus against a regime that would have arrested such authors had they put their names on it? If you're not willing to lose your business due to government depermissioning or face arrest to speak, then I guess you don't mean it. Is a ridiculous standard and a false trade-off and falser framing. The fact that such a trade-off exists in the first place is already proof positive that the permission-based system of life and work is pernicious and predatory. Who save a tyrant or a demagogue would choose or demand such a system? Come out where we can shoot you, said the powerful force to the freedom fighter. Come sign our government registry to be allowed to speak against the government is not the most reassuring of offers. Are we really expected to say yes? Those who debate me must provide proper ID is the demand of a bully planning to come for you on some other board. If this is really about ideas and their validity, then why do you need to know who we are? You can keep your credentials if you like and appeal to them and claim credence is due. How's that been working out for you, BTW? Lol. We the Annans are happy to engage from a position of no base trust and earn such respect as we may garner fairly, freely, and openly in the reputation economy. Can anyone really find principled fault with such a course?
Well, yes, as a matter of fact. I certainly can. Allow me to elaborate. Allowing speech to flourish and a true market of ideas is a dead-end road meant to trap people in the information mode of secondary thinking when they should instead be focused on primary thinking and spiritual creativity. Information, whether anonymous or not, solves nothing and advances nothing. On the contrary, it plays directly to the system's favor by keeping engaged in system information discourse. The last thing people need is more information and debate. What people need is knowledge. Spiritual knowledge. Directly accessed and directly known. Whether this knowledge is publicly communicated as a commodity and marketplace is irrelevant. What matters is that the direct knowledge occurred. More on that later. What exactly are people like El Gato Malo advocating for here? Are they suggesting that their wonderful anonymous ideas will eventually and quite magically activate some form of dissent or revolution at the level of the masses, all without people like El Gato Malo ever having to put any skin in the game other than to blog and tweet their defiance anonymously/pseudonymously? Do people like El Gato Malo really believe they are safe behind their pseudonyms? Seriously? Is private/anonymous dissent enough to excuse making a living while under total public compliance with and submission to the system? I'll refer to an earlier post to expand on the problem of information and secondary thinking, my excerpt below in italics. Those who oppose the totalitarian aims espoused by organizations like the World Economic Forum recognize the information manipulation and seek to counteract it with truthful information. Though far more noble in intent and motivation, the aim of disseminating such truth-seeking information misses the mark concerning the bigger picture of human consciousness, and its relation to reality. In short, the war we are in is fundamentally a spiritual war, not an information war. Many recognize and understand the totalitarian push to control the narrative. They fail to discern that the core problem is the exclusive and obsessive focus on engaging with narrative through secondary thinking, thereby keeping consciousness firmly entrenched in representational reality as reality, or, in keeping consciousness locked in the information age and its related thinking. Clown World is not simply striving to control information and secondary thinking, they want to ensure human consciousness remains trapped in a state of information overload and secondary thinking. Though they claim otherwise, I suspect that at the deepest, most fundamental level, Clown World and the demonic forces it serves welcome information opposition to their secondary level information manipulations because it keeps human consciousness firmly fixated on representations as reality rather than on reality. Thus, keeping people engaged in information wars not only helps to distract from the spiritual war but also helps to hinder the further development of human consciousness. I am not implying that those waging the information war against Clown World are intentionally entrapping people at the secondary level of thinking. Unlike the World Economic Forum, which deliberately uses information to enslave people in secondary level thinking via representations that are directly opposed to God and creation, information warriors on the side of good share representations that often can and do act as intermediaries to truth and reality. However, many information warriors treat the intermediaries themselves as truth and reality, and this is where the problems set in. The information warriors who utilize representational intermediaries or the people who engage with the intermediaries the warriors produce, be it in the form of writing, symbols, spoken language, art, video, etc., contribute virtually nothing to the spiritual war or the development of consciousness if they go no further than the intermediaries in terms of thinking and knowing or, worse, regard the intermediaries as reality. Winning the spiritual war and connecting with truth and reality does not and cannot boil down to being informed, an essentially passive state in which one allows the external to shape, fashion, give shape to, and teach reality via representations presented and accepted as reality. Being informed in that manner keeps one asleep and the plaything of Morpheus and his dream-forming brothers. Informed people who regard representations as reality are dreamers living in a dreamland. I am not implying that the representational is dispensable. On the contrary, it is vital, but only when we understand that it serves as a go-between and not a final destination. In this sense, the representations the good info warriors provide are far superior to the information promulgated by the likes of the WEF, which serves more as a go-nowhere rather than a go-between. Yet representations on the side of good can only do good if they are treated as intermediaries, that is, used to orient and or connect to reality. That connection to reality happens beyond the representational, in the realm of primary thinking, the realm of non-representational direct knowing originating from and connecting to the primal self. Although representational, secondary thinking can inspire, motivate, and guide individuals toward primary thinking, it cannot substitute for primary thinking. But I have observed that truth has two meanings, truth as knowledge of reality, and truth as reality itself. In this sense, information via representations, language, symbols, is truth as knowledge of reality, while direct knowing is truth about reality itself. But IF offers another way to think about it. I wish to know, not actuality, but the truth about actuality. And I may learn what this truth is, only because in me, the knowing subject, there is a source of truth and because I may communicate with this truth. Communicating with this source of truth goes well beyond the state of being informed, i.e., of knowing actuality. It requires locating an innate, internal source of truth that can connect with reality directly, moving beyond the realm of representations. Information is intended to serve as a bridge to reality, not substitute reality. Information as reality is, at best, only partial reality. We see the bridge but do not understand what it is for or mistake it for something else. Like all bridges, information provides a means to get across from one side to another. Their purpose is distorted if they remain uncrossed or if the other side into which they extend is disbelieved or denied. As Birdemic-Peck notes, truth is not something given objectively, but rather a creative achievement. It is creative discovery, rather than the reflected knowledge of an object or of being. Truth is the creative transfiguration of reality. As a final point, I will add that dissent is no substitute for repentance. All Christians must resist being held hostage by the system, even if it threatens their livelihoods, but in lieu of that, Christians must repent their involvement and compliance with the system, even if they don't have any choice in the matter or even if gotta make a living. Private, anonymous, or pseudonymous dissent is not repentance. Not even close. I don't expect bloggers like El Gato Malo to get any of what I have covered above, but it is my sincere hope that, at least, some Christians out there will /do. Philosophy, insane or boring? An apocryphal story about Wittgenstein. Bruce Charlton. There is an apocryphal story hereabouts, recalled from memory, about Wittgenstein when he was working as a laboratory assistant in the Royal Victoria Infirmary, Newcastle upon Tyne during the Second World War, lodging in the Jesmond House, illustrated above, that is currently inhabited by some family friends. Apparently he turned up, unannounced, and at first unidentified, at a philosophy department seminar presumably after his work had finished. I like to imagine he was still wearing his white lab coat. He sat, stony-faced, through the fumbling talk, as the whisper went around that he was present. When it came to the question time, nobody said anything, waiting for Wittgenstein to speak. Wittgenstein is supposed to have delivered the following crushing line: "Well, that was very interesting. Now, shall we do some philosophy?" And then he, of course, proceeded to take over the proceedings. If there is any truth in this, Wittgenstein was being typically arrogant and cruel, but there is a moral. He did have a point, in the sense that there are few things more boring and futile than studying and expounding about philosophy, as happens in 99.something% of seminars. Yet, for those with the taste for the activity, there is little in life more fascinating than actually doing philosophy. In other words, I think Wittgenstein may have been making the point that there is a world of difference between talking about and doing. Actually doing philosophy, by oneself or with a few other people, is, like many of the best things, something that can only be done from a genuine motivation, from genuinely wanting to know oneself and for personal reasons. Wittgenstein himself tried to do philosophy in a formal academic setting, in his lectures, but, while he sometimes found an audience of suitable stooges who stimulated him in the ways he required, I don't think he truly succeeded for other people. Because Wittgenstein's motivations were not their motivations, and his disciples turned out every bit as conventionally academic and externally driven as the adherents of any other school. So perhaps, like all creative work, real philosophy is essentially a solitary activity. Note, the insane of the title may seem obscure. What I was getting at was that when some person, usually an individual, is doing philosophy, he is doing so for personal reasons that may not be at all widely shared. His work is quite likely to seem incomprehensible, even crazy, especially when seriously pursued, and over a significant time span. To other people, he seemed to be engaged in a trivial pursuit, using idiosyncratic methods, in a thought world of his own. Insane? A big problem with spiritual interventions, such as prayer/meditation, especially in groups. Bruce Charlton. I have been very unimpressed by what I know of the results of group prayer, or meditation, especially when groups are arranged to pray for something or another. Such things seem recurrently popular among Christians, and also in the New Age and occult world. Those involved in group prayer/meditation/ritual almost invariably seem to be emotionally satisfied by their activities, yet, as so often, anyone outside of the magic circle of participants sees only a kind of self-fulfilling psychology at work. In principle, this could be because the change is at an imperceptible spiritual level of things, or it could be that actually nothing valuable has happened, but worse, I suspect that such attempts to do good by prayer or meditation often do actual harm. This is because people nearly always seem to be asking for the wrong things. Either they are asking for some outcome that is inferred from distorted or false information derived from the mass media globalist bureaucracy, or else they are asking for something abstract that itself is an evil-motivated concept. I mean something like peace, justice, healing, safety, or the triumph of some particular side in some dispute. When it comes to matters outside of our direct experience, we are on shaky ground when we engage in attempted spiritual machinations. It is more important to pray or meditate for the discernment to know what is needed, than to try and achieve by consciously willed spiritual force some particular outcome, concerning situations for which our understanding is derivative and insecure, the significance of which is often externally dictated, situations when we personally don't really know what is happening, nor what would be a better thing to happen. The problem is not so much that group prayer meditation does not work as that it does actual harm, because the harm of asking for wrong things is amplified by the group dynamics of the situation. There is no such thing as value neutrality. When we are not working to sustain the side of God and the good, we will very probably be lending spiritual aid to the side of evil, and or opening ourselves to demonic influence, inviting it in. Note added, as so often, I think this problem is a modern one. In earlier eras of human consciousness, men were, to a much greater extent than now, spontaneously immersed in both the group consciousness and the spirit world of the divine. But one aspect of modern consciousness is that this is no longer the case. Our freedom and individuality comes with the flip side that we don't have a natural, and largely unconscious connection with group, angels or God. We must make a conscious personal choice to attain knowledge of the good, and positive groupishness tends to be rare and evanescent. Astrology comes up trumps. William Wildblood. There's nothing like being wise after the event, but no astrologer will be surprised by the assassination attempt on Donald Trump, given the planetary patterns of the time. Below is the chart of President Trump with the transits of the day added. The important thing to note is the Mars/Uranus conjunction in 26 Taurus right at the top of the chart. This is in a direct square to Trump's Mars in Leo, and by association, since they are conjunct, his ascendant, which is also in Leo. Incidentally, Trump both looks and behaves like an archetypal Leo, even down to the mane of hair. Mars/Uranus signifies sudden surprises, accidents and even potential violence. When the two conjoined planets form such a close contact with natal Mars, all these possibilities are intensified. The square to the ascendant indicates an assault on the body, and when you factor in that the Mars/Uranus conjunction also sits on the fixed star Algol, you have an increased likelihood of misfortune. Algol means the demon's head, the demon in this case being the Gorgon Medusa, and is reputed to be among the most violent and dangerous of all the fixed stars, with accidents and injuries common when connected to important parts of the horoscope. So, what saved Trump? If we look at the matter from a purely astrological perspective, we could say that the exact sextile from transiting Jupiter to Pluto in the 12th house might have had something to do with it. It is the 12th house that is being assaulted here, and Venus has just made her entry in that house, providing another protecting influence. Donald Trump's birth chart must have been analyzed many times over the last few years, but I have not looked at it before. Having now done so, I am struck at how well his conjunction of Sun and Uranus both trine to Jupiter describes his ebullient, over-the-top character. I have already mentioned the leonine qualities, but perhaps the most significant factor is combative Mars in Leo sitting right on the ascendant. Fight, fight, fight indeed. Also to note is the Mercury/Neptune square, showing tendencies to lies and deception on the one hand, and an intuitive ability to tap into the mystical undercurrents of life on the other. The Sun and Uranus are both in the 10th house, as is the North Node, all showing public prominence. Like him or not, this is a chart of a man who makes a mark. What made me a writer? Bruce Charlton. When I was a late teenager and young adult, I envisaged being a writer, by which I meant some kind of creative writer, if not as a living, as a significant sideline to my job. Aside from a few comedy sketches for performance in reviews, and scientific articles for journals, which were collaborative, I did not publish anything much in the way of writing until I was about 28, when something clicked, and I suddenly became able to write fluently and quickly, and get published, and quite often paid for, essays and journalistic pieces. For the next couple of decades I published a great deal of this kind of stuff, and we have in the past couple of days been sorting through many boxes of such material, that had been piled up in various places for many years. I found it amazing, and somewhat appalling, to rediscover the sheer quantity and variety of these outpourings. Quite aside from a couple of hundred mainstream papers and a few books, which were done in relation to my academic job, it seems I also did a very large number of editorials, book reviews, comments, commentaries and columns, in all kinds of places. I must have been publishing something every week or two for many years. These were placed in all sorts of publications, prestigious scientific and medical journals, national newspapers and magazines, and also numerous obscure and small circulation outputs such as literary and cultural small magazines, professional and trade journals, and local in-house magazines and newspapers for places I worked, and places I didn't work. For example, I published scores of things in the Oxford magazine. So I really did end up as a writer, albeit I found my niche in non-fiction rather than in the poems, plays, short stories and novels which I attempted to write, and failed to write well, in the first decade of adulthood. From 2010, I all but ceased to do this kind of paperwork, apart from 4 books done for Buckingham University Press and a handful of scientific papers, and instead began to blog on a daily, actually about 1.5 pieces per day, basis. This blogging amounts to a broadly similar number of words as I used to publish on paper. And, up to now, who knows what comes next, this continues. What is strange is that, as I mentioned, it took a good decade of trying before I was able to write, at least I could not before age 28 write in the way I have found enjoyable and straightforward since. Partly this was a matter of psychological maturing, partly a matter of finding the form within which my writing flows, and partly it was the training of writing scientific papers, journal articles, which activity made me unself-conscious and gradually take an objective attitude towards what I had written. As a young would-be writer, I could not tell whether what I had written was any good, because I judged my own writing from the inside, and could not see how it struck other people. Once I learned how to do this self-monitoring, learned how to evaluate what I had written by the same standards I would apply to what other people had written, this seemed to provide the breakthrough I needed. It was writing scientific papers, as first author, and then having them critiqued and corrected by my doctoral supervisor, and other research collaborators, that did the trick for me. Which I still find surprising, but that was what happened, that was what made a writer of me, a writer of the kind I am, and have been. Note, the other thing I was good at was teaching. But that was a thing I never needed to learn. I was good at it from the first attempt. This may be hereditary, since there are several good teachers in my family, including father, siblings, and a child. Memories of the Birdemic-Peck years of 2020 to 2022. Bruce Charlton. Does anyone vaguely recall those remote, almost legendary, days of 2020-22? The Birdemic and the Peck campaign. And in the midst of it all, the lying, resentment, and spite of the MLB anti-racism debacle of later summer 2020, and its permanent sequelae in law and regulations and social practices. If you really try, can you remember how most people, and all institutions, behaved? What they said, and what they willingly, and with pleasurable anticipation, approved and anticipated? I do. It isn't a subject I think about much, but it is an era that permanently affected my evaluation of people and organizations, especially Christian churches. It was a time when true colors were revealed, starkly exposed. The metaphorical gloves were off to reveal the iron fist inside the velvet. Proudly wearing the cloth or paper masks, and displaying selfies of it, so many people unmasked their real natures. It's not so much that I dwell upon their embrace of the agenda of evil and their reluctance to think, reason, learn, their cowardice and the short-termist hedonism that governed them. But that, in terms of my system of mental evaluation, 2020-21 established the categories within which I place entities, in terms of their motivations, their aspirations, ultimately the side they have taken in the spiritual war. These are the categories from which I continue to make inferences. And this is why I have zero optimism, that is no expectation of things positively improving, emanating from any of the people, institutions, or systems of the public discourse, or the establishment system. And this is why I am saddened and disappointed to observe so many people who are optimistic about the way things are going. So many who imagine that the West, the world, has bottomed out, and begun a rise to better times, or done a U-turn, and begun to retreat from the strategy of self-annihilation. But spiritually nothing has changed for the better, There has been no large-scale repentance, therefore nothing substantive has been learned. Therefore, since change is inevitable, we should infer that those who chose the side of evil in 2020-22 have since come to endorse the assumptions of that side more deeply and thoroughly, whatever their self-identification may be. I regard these worldly optimists as not merely deluded, but as having been seduced from good, if they ever supported it, and made choice of the wrong side. Why are most mass media populated only by people I dislike and despise, and nobody at all with whom I wish to empathize? Bruce Charlton. For me, much of the mass media output is ruined and made intolerable because populated entirely by dislikable characters. Indeed, dislikable is putting it mildly. Most media dramatis personae, whether in TV, movies, songs, plays or novels, are people I regard as actively loathsome individuals. I used to theorize this on the basis that it was part of the strategy of corruption, for instance that heroes were, over the past decades, replaced by anti-heroes, and virtuous exemplars were replaced by victims. This is surely correct, so far as it goes. But I now think the proximate reason may be simpler. That the authors of TV, movies, songs, plays and novels are writing about what they know, and they know evil from the inside and by experience, and know almost nothing of heroism, virtue of goodness. The authors and artists themselves typically lack such virtues to begin with, and to make matters worse have strategically affiliated themselves firmly to the devil's agenda. I mean, the authors have embraced the anti-God, anti-creation, anti-good agenda that is pursued by the global establishment, top-down, and via all possible means. From direct coercive power, laws and regulations, through subsidy and awards, to multi-pronged ideological propaganda that naturally, and very importantly, includes the arts. Furthermore, the mass media world they have chosen to inhabit and in which they participate is pervasively corrupt, the world of movies and television, directors and actors, publishers and marketing, patrons and arts administrators, reviews and critics, musicians and production. In conclusion, there are, by my judgment, no virtuous characters in the great bulk of mass media, simply because those who produce the mass media are themselves deficient in virtue and live out their lives among some of the most corrupt and value-inverted human beings the world has ever known. And, what is worse, authors depend on the good opinion of these corrupted persons, insofar as the authors desire money, fame and high status. With authors being as they are and working in the environment they actually do, it is to be expected that the modern mass media is replete with actively evil protagonists, liars, cheats, selfish hedonists, psychopaths, while the truly virtuous are depicted unconvincingly, or most often not at all. And when there is any attempt to depict genuine virtue, because authors personally know nothing of such matters, these characters inevitably will be pathetic, miserable, simple-minded, deluded, but inevitably victims. It's not that authors are merely representative of the corruptions of this era, things are much worse than that. It is that authors are among the avant-garde of evil, they personally are active advocates of, not merely going along with, the agenda of evil, and that authors inhabit a social world of like-minded persons, the society of those who have chosen, professionally, to join the primary servants and implementers of the demonic strategy. A lot of age, very little wisdom. Francis Berger. About 5 years ago, I documented the following observations on the subject of wisdom and old age. That people inevitably grow wiser as they age is a cliché, and a misconception. More often than not, my life experience has revealed the opposite to be the case. Most people I know from the older generations have not accrued an ounce of wisdom as they have aged. In fact, a considerable number have gone in the opposite direction and have become increasingly foolish and stupid as they entered or waded deeper into their senior years. It goes without saying that I am not referring to those suffering from some form of age-related mental decline or those battling dementia or Alzheimer's, but to men and women in their 60s, 70s, and beyond who still possess all their mental faculties yet seem utterly incapable or ruthlessly uninterested in re-examining their assumptions or reassessing the core of their beliefs against the backdrop of their experiences. The excerpt above is from a 2019 post in which I ultimately identified old leftists as the worst exemplifiers of unwisdom in old age. However, the events of 2020 to 2022 made it clear that the lack of wisdom in old age applies to virtually everyone in their 60s, 70s, and beyond, regardless of political leaning, lived experience, or professed faith. Wisdom denotes knowledge, learning, and experience, and can be extended to include attributes like learned, sagacious, cunning, sane, prudent, discreet, experienced, having the power of discerning and judging rightly. I don't know about you, but nearly all the old people I know, or encounter, display a glaring absence of any of the above attributes. So much for accruing wisdom via experience over the years, which makes me wonder why wisdom has all but disappeared from this mortal coil. I sense our current wisdom void in the West connects directly with the mass despiritualization or faux spiritualization of Western people over the past half-century or so, a process that also elevated the ego to fantastic heights. Wisdom seems to possess a deeper spiritual quality than intelligence, suggesting that a shallow spirit entails shallow wisdom. Activating or accessing wisdom seems to require a direct connection to the true self. Without that, wisdom is little more than soap, bubbles and fairy dust. To sum up, very few people appear capable of learning from experience anymore. The age of the sage appears to be behind us. Well behind us. The cosmic perspective, strictly optional or unavoidable. Bruce Charlton. Most people seem to regard ultimate questions, metaphysics or the cosmic perspective as irrelevant frills, for people with too little to do, too much time on their hands, at best, but more likely as delusional nonsense, and something that ought to be avoided. The subject certainly is avoided, except to warn against it, in all of mainstream public life. My understanding is that this avoidance is very obvious, is like a veering away from somewhere that people are actively trying not to confront. The elephant in the room is that what people want, do talk about, is pointless. That is an implicit fact, and as such the choice is between pointless fun and pointless misery, so it's all about fun. And when life feels shallow, then depth is supposed to come from altruism, from fighting against bad things like racism, global warming, or fighting for the rights of officially oppressed groups and their representatives. But if life is indeed pointless, or is meaning and purpose supposed to arise from striving to make other people's pointless existences more fun and more comfortable? I guess this is supposed to be how it works, but, of course, it doesn't work. When things are pointless, well, they are pointless, and manipulating our temporary emotions or feelings doesn't affect that horrible fact. The assumption seems to be that there are no answers, and cannot be any answers to the big questions. Philosophy has even defined itself in terms of failing to answer the perennial questions, but just wittering on about them, anyway. So we should not waste time on raising the big questions. It can only make us depressed. What about religion? What about Christianity? What about churches? Well, religion is about churches, and churches are about sticking to a list of rules, or not sticking to them, but pretending anyway, which is just more of the same stuff we get plenty of elsewhere, and about worship. Worship is supposedly what God, or the gods, wants us to do. And this is supposed to please, or appease, God, and make us take a better perspective on life. It doesn't, of course, but why should it, even in principle? Worship does not address the question of ultimates, of what it is all about. From this angle, church is just part of the colossal system of evasion in which we live, just another way of whiling away our pointless, mayfly lives until we crumple and die, and after we die, more of the same worship stuff, but forever. If not, then what? What actually would, or at least could, be helpful? My answer is, reminders of the real cosmic perspective. So that our mundane lives can be seen, albeit only temporarily, but maybe something will last, in their place in the scheme of things. A reminder of where we are from, where we are going, and what positive relevance our current lives have for all this. I say positive relevance, because that is something grossly lacking. Avoiding stuff, self-sacrifice etc. is meaningless, unless there are positive and permanent things we ought to be doing. It is useful, fundamentally valuable, for us to know our lives in terms of what we personally are positively we are supposed to achieve in them. A cosmic perspective for the here and now and the mundane. That would seem like a valid activity for religion, whether in terms of teaching, reading, conversation, or of formal church rituals and the like. What's the point of average, and bad, work in the arts, opera, plays, music, poetry etc.? Bruce Charlton. It's an interesting question as to whether it is worth having the massive average stuff, not to mention bad stuff, in the arts, or whether we only really need the really good stuff. Of course, it may be argued that the really good stuff could not be produced without the average, and bad, stuff, because people need to learn. And it could also be said that we need to have the bad stuff in order that we learn what makes the really good really good. Well, maybe. But once the really good stuff has been produced, and once people know it for what it is, what then? Does the average stuff need to hang around? Does it demand attention? Is it worthwhile? It seems to me that there is a strong argument that we don't need anything but the very good, and that we only really need the really good stuff. Indeed, it is possible that having so much average to poor stuff hanging around is a bad thing. It wastes people time, and wasted time is an evil, leaving aside the considerable quantities of the actively bad. Consider opera. There are maybe a score of really good operas, and the rest seem to serve no essential value. They hang around because some people want to listen to, and perform, operas more often than we could tolerate the really good stuff, so we get a great mass of pretty worthless opera being performed, recorded and watched. Yet we could just watch, and perform, the really good stuff, and simply not go to the opera, or listen to recordings, very often. We could just do other things in the meanwhile. In other words, the problem is a kind of addiction. Opera people get addicted to opera, so they end up overdosing on the mediocre stuff, because the alternative is to get habituated to the really good stuff by taking it too often. They consume, and perform, mediocre stuff, because there isn't enough good stuff, and they cannot stop taking the stuff, they cannot stay off the stuff long enough to refresh their palates. Classical music in general is the same, only a few really good composers, although there are quite a lot of very good pieces, individual pieces. Still, so insatiable is the desire for music, that most of what gets recorded, played, listened to is a kind of filler, and often actively unpleasant, at that. Plays are even more extremely thus. There are, in English, very few good plays, and the vast bulk of plays are just ephemeral ways of passing an evening, keyed into current fashion rather than the human condition. And the demand for bulk mediocrity is again because there just aren't enough really good things to supply the addiction. And poetry. There are very few worthwhile poems, even from the best poets, and there aren't many of them, and the really good poems are all but lost in an ocean of average to bad poetry, such that most people never seem to find them, and spend their lives paddling in the shallows and swamps. Blaise Pascal commented that all of humanity's problems stem from man's inability to sit quietly in a room alone. Well, not all of the problems, but the arts confirm what is seen in other domains of life, that much of what is mediocre, time-wasting, and corrupting, is due to our craving for diversion. And most diversion comes via novelty, not just the arts, but gossip, news, critique, is the prime attribute of that which diverts us in the mass and social media, and everyday life. Hence the preponderance of so much that is average and bad in the arts and elsewhere. Equality, a modern myth. William Wildblood. My book By No Means Equal was published a few months ago, and the advent of a new government in the UK brings its message to the fore because this government is motivated, theoretically, at least, by the principle of equality. To a degree, this principle drives all Western liberal democracies, but the book argues that equality is what you have left when you strip life of its spiritual component, and try to preserve some kind of moral foundation. There are also those now whose spiritual understanding is secondary to the leftist ideology with which most modern people are indoctrinated, who think that because God is one and love the cornerstone of truth, all souls are necessarily equal. They don't see that in a created world souls may all derive from God and be equal in potential, but they are at very different levels of manifesting the fullness of spiritual being. Souls are all expressions of the divine, but they range enormously in how much of the divine they can express, and this is both a matter of will and of actual development. This understanding takes into account both oneness and difference and realizes that neither can be followed as a principle without the other to balance it. If everything were equal, then nothing could be, because everything would be the same. It is inequality that allows for anything to be something. Equality is actually a property of matter undisturbed by spirit, or the logos aspect of spirit. Hence, equality as a philosophical principle is associated with materialism, while inequality forms part of the spiritual conception of life, something we can better appreciate when we realize that inequality indicates the presence of the vertical axis of being, in other words transcendence, while equality is restricted to life conceived solely along the horizontal, life without transcendence. For the full view, the fact of inequality must be considered in association with that of oneness, which in turn must always be combined with the truth of difference, and that means hierarchy. The enforcement of equality is an attempt to banish a proper spiritual worldview or create a false one. Those organizations and ideologies that seek to do this are anti-spiritual in nature, though many may present themselves as spiritually motivated. But for the forces that work against God, both materialism and false spirituality work equally well. In fact, false spirituality is better because the spiritual impulse cannot be suppressed indefinitely, so it becomes more useful to divert it into wrong paths than to deny it altogether, even if an initial period of denial helps in the latter corruption of it. The equality doctrine is part of the corruption of spirituality. If you are interested in this subject of equality, the moral justification for the contemporary deviation from truth, the book goes into it in more detail and from various aspects. Love and justice are divine attributes, but equality is a distorted parody of these things, and to find out where it comes from you can go right back to the serpent in the Garden of Eden. If ideas alone are sufficient, then Jesus is dispensable. Francis Berger. This post addresses the much touted and utterly misguided argument that ideas are ultimate and matter far more than people who express the ideas. The argument comes in many shapes and flavors. Still, they all convey the same assumption: truth does not need people to be true. Ideas and truth exist independently of the person. Truth does not require any person to be true. It can be divorced from people entirely. Ideas are not contingent upon any person to be true. A person's expression of the truth is of far more significance than the person expressing the truth. A person's being only interferes with ideas and the truths they convey. Better to just separate the person from the idea altogether and focus on the idea, because in the end, what is paramount is the idea, not the person communicating it. And so on. I'm not sure when Christians embraced this abstract Platonic Enlightenment democratic academic Hollywood bullshit assumption. Suffice it to say the vast majority have not only enthusiastically adopted this assumption but go to great lengths to staunchly defend it and vociferously champion it. Who I am as a person is irrelevant. They cry. What is truly relevant are my ideas. And you don't need to know who I am to consider my ideas, because my ideas are greater than me. You don't need to establish any relationship with me as a person to recognize and understand the truth inherent in my ideas. The truth inherent in those ideas is more than sufficient. Establish a relationship with that. Now, if any of the above is even remotely true, then the person of Jesus is utterly superfluous. If ideas matter more than the person expressing the ideas, then Jesus would not have had to live in this world. God could have simply allowed him to implant the idea of resurrection and other truths into people's minds telepathically or some such thing. But this is not what happened. The ideas Jesus expressed required his person to back them up. The two were indivisible, and they remain indivisible today. The personal is truth, and the truth is personal. You must know Jesus as a person to recognize and understand the ideas he expressed. You cannot separate him from his ideas. Any attempt to do so reduces the impact and glory of his ideas. Give it a shot sometime. Think about the truth Jesus communicated without thinking about Jesus and see how it goes. More precisely, truth is not the recognition of some objective, impersonal fact, it is a personal, creative act. The transmission of ideas and truth requires a creative relationship between persons for the truth to be true. Relating only to an idea can, at best, reveal only partial truths or worse. Note added, unpersoning ideas is a material, reductionist, positivist approach to ideas and truth. Better to side with Dostoevsky, who stated,
If someone proved to me that Christ is outside the truth and that in reality the truth were outside of Christ, then I should prefer to remain with Christ rather than with the truth.
Late blooming talent. Bruce Charlton. There does not seem to be any reliable correlation between the degree of talent, flair, specialness exhibited when young, and ultimate achievement. Of course there sometimes is. My namesake, but not related, Bobby Charlton was perhaps England's greatest footballer of all time, and his talent was evident from a very early age. Indeed, he was famous for his prowess even in a county obsessed with the sport. For instance, at age 11 the local education authority redirected Bobby from the rugby-playing state grammar school he was supposed to attend according to residence, to the soccer-playing school in Bedlington, which had earlier been attended by my father, himself no mean footballer at semi-pro level. And when Bobby was old enough to sign professionally it was a national event, and his choice of Manchester United was widely reported in the press. Yet there are many exceptions. I have, over the years, known of quite a few young people whose flair and talent seemed destined for greatness, yet the sparkle went flat, or they took the wrong path, or their interests changed, or the world failed to recognize their special gifts. This bureaucratic era has, indeed, become actively hostile to genuine creativity. Exceptions also work the other way. In 1981 went to a superb evening of alternative comedy at a local venue, which boasted a galaxy of fresh talent, such as Rick Mayall, who dominated the show. But there was also a rather lame, embarrassing, and forgettable female double act called French and Saunders. I.e. Dawn French and Jennifer Saunders, then aged about 24 or 25. Of all those brilliant comics, it was French and Saunders who, not long afterwards, went on to the best and most illustrious careers, individually and as the same duo. Yet, at the time, I could detect nothing of their later brilliance, probably because it wasn't yet there. A year or two later, I went to a one-woman review in the Edinburgh Fringe Festival by someone called Emma Thompson, which was so bad that it ranks as one of my most embarrassing, least enjoyable evenings in the theatre. Admittedly, Emma Thompson was barking up the wrong tree, and she was never a good comedian as such, but she became, of course, one of the very best movie actresses of the past several decades. Yet I could see nothing of this, back in the early 1980s. At the time, I just wanted to avoid ever watching her again. Perhaps the most stark example of late emerging talent is provided by my English literature tutor at Durham University, Derek Todd. Derek had earlier been a lecturer at Queen's University, Belfast, where a young undergraduate brought some poems to show him. Derek found them not good, and gently tried to dissuade the chap from further efforts in that direction. That untalented young student poet was Seamus Heaney, who later won the Nobel Prize for Literature. My assumption is not that Derek missed Heaney's budding talent and ability, but that it was not then evident. The point is that sometimes people change, and quite a lot. And sometimes that can happen very late, as when novelists take up writing in middle age or old age, and discover a surprising talent. One of my wife's favorite light comic authors is Jodie Taylor, who began writing and published only after retirement, aged about 60, which is very old for a humorous author, most of whom cease to be really funny before 30. From this late standing start, she has poured out dozens books after books ever since her debut in 2013, at an astonishing rate by any standard. This is very unusual, very unlikely, maybe unique. But it happened, which just goes to show. I personally don't rate Heaney as a poet. More exactly, I do not regard him as a real poet. But that's another story. The worst lies are the ones we tell ourselves. Francis Berger. The Age of Dishonesty. That's what I would name our current era, if anyone asked me to name it. Dishonesty because the lies that saturate this time and place are as ubiquitous as the air we breathe. We have reached the point where people will candidly defend lying while calmly outlining why dishonesty is sometimes beneficial and often necessary. Of course, the same people who justify dishonesty are quick to vehemently pounce on the perceived untruthfulness of others and call them out for their chicanery. My lies are defensible. Yours? Not so much. Whatever the case, I have noticed that virtually all deception and duplicity stems from the lies we tell ourselves, those cunning, sly, crafty, tricky little shards of personal subterfuge that most of us conspire to deny altogether. Although people may lie to others only occasionally, most seem to lie to themselves incessantly, as evidenced by the relentless explanations, rationalizations, justifications, clarifications, and reconciliations on display in every public and, presumably, private discourse. Although we often criticize and condemn lies told to others, we tend to adopt a far more forgiving attitude concerning the lies we tell ourselves. We assume that our self-delusions are harmless or muted. We appear to endorse the notion that they are unavoidable. Perhaps there is something to that, however, unavoidable is not synonymous with acceptable, yet we tend to treat it as such. One thing is certain: the true self rejects all self-dishonesty, particularly unrepented self-dishonesty. It cannot engage in that commerce with the father of lies, but the worst of our unnecessary false selves can and do, quite eagerly and energetically.